The moment everything shattered. Some moments change your life forever. For Emily Carter, that moment came on a cold November evening when the man she loved looked at her ultrasound photo and tore it into pieces. This is a story about love, betrayal, truth, and the courage it takes to stand alone when the world falls apart. It's about a woman who refused to give up, and a man who almost lost everything because he couldn't see past his own pain. Emily Carter was 20, 7 years old, hardworking, and honest to her core. She had grown up in a small town in Oregon, raised by a single mother who taught her that integrity mattered more than wealth. When she landed a job at Sterling Tech Industries in Seattle, she thought her life was finally coming together. She never imagined she'd fall in love with her boss, and she certainly never imagined it would end the way it did. Daniel Sterling was 34, a self-made billionaire who had built his technology empire from nothing. Tall, intense, with dark hair that was always slightly disheveled from running, his hands through it during stressful meetings. He was the kind of man who commanded attention without trying. But what drew Emily to him wasn't his wealth or his power. It was the way he listened when she spoke, the kindness in his eyes when he thought no one was watching, and the vulnerability he showed only to her during their late night conversations. They had been together for 4 months, keeping their relationship secret because office romances were complicated, especially when one person was the CEO. Those 4 months had been the happiest of Emily's life. Daniel made her feel seen, valued, and cherished in ways she'd never experienced before. That's why she thought he would be happy about the baby. That's why she never expected what happened next. Emily stood in Daniel's penthouse apartment, the city lights of Seattle glittering through the floor to ceiling windows behind him. Her hands trembled as she held out the ultrasound photo, the black and white image showing a tiny figure that was barely visible but undeniably real. She had rehearsed this moment a dozen times during the drive over, imagining his surprise, his joy, maybe even his fear. What she never imagined was the expression that crossed his face when he understood what she was showing him. Daniel took the photo from her fingers, his jaw tightening as he studied it. For just a second, Emily thought she saw something flicker in his eyes, something that might have been hope or wonder. But then his expression hardened into something she had never seen before, something cold and distant and terrifying. Without saying a word, he tore the ultrasound in half. Then he tore it again and again, until small pieces of the precious image fluttered to the marble floor, like snow that would never melt. Emily couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but stare at those scattered pieces that moments ago had been the first glimpse of their child. This baby is not mine. Daniel's voice was like ice, each word carefully measured and deliberately cruel. It cannot possibly be mine. The words hung in the air between them, impossible and devastating. Emily felt the world tilt beneath her feet, as though gravity itself had shifted. "What are you talking about?" Her voice came out as barely a whisper. "Daniel, you're the only man I've been with." "The only one?" He turned away from her, walking to the windows that overlooked the city. He'd conquered through sheer determination, and brilliant strategy. He wore an expensive charcoal suit that probably cost more than she made in 3 months. Every line of his body radiated controlled power, but now that power felt like a weapon aimed directly at her heart. I had testicular cancer when I was 24. His voice remained cold, detached, as if he were discussing a business transaction rather than destroying her life. The treatment saved my life, but it destroyed any chance of me having children. The doctors were very clear about this 10 years ago. Complete infertility. 0 sperm count. No possibility of natural conception whatsoever. Each sentence landed like a physical blow. Emily pressed her hand against her stomach instinctively, as if she could protect the tiny life growing there from these terrible words. Daniel, please listen to me. For the past 4 months, you've been the only man in my life. I haven't been with anyone else. I wouldn't do that. How can you even think I would do something like this? He turned to face her, and the look in his eyes made her blood run cold. It wasn't anger anymore. It was contempt, pure and absolute. Because you're intelligent, Emily. You researched me before you started working here. You knew about my wealth, my connections, my influence. What better target for a pregnancy trap than a wealthy man who would never suspect? Because he thinks he's sterile. No. The word burst from her lips with desperate force. Daniel, I love you. I've loved you since that first night we worked together, fixing the Morrison presentation. When you brought me coffee at 3 in the morning, and we talked until sunrise. I never wanted anything from you except you. Just you. You wanted security. He spoke with brutal calmness that was somehow worse than shouting. You wanted this penthouse, the expensive dinners, the designer clothes I bought you. And now you want child support that will set you up for life. How much did the real father pay you to pass his child off as mine? Or did you do this on your own, thinking I'd be too proud or too naive to demand a paternity test? Emily felt tears streaming down her face, hot and unstoppable. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be the same man who had held her during thunderstorms because he remembered she'd mentioned being afraid of lightning as a child. This couldn't be the man who had told her she made him believe in happiness again after years of loneliness at the top. Get out. Daniel pointed toward the door with one steady hand that didn't shake at all. Leave now and never contact me again. If you try to reach me, if you come to my office, if you approach anyone in my circle, you will regret it. I have the resources to make your life very difficult. Emily, don't test me. But the baby. Her voice broke on the words. Our baby, Daniel. This is your daughter or son. How can you just walk away from your own child? There is no child of mine. His words were final, absolute, like a judge delivering a death sentence. There's only your lie, and I'm done with liars. Security will escort you out. Emily stood frozen for one more heartbeat, looking at the man she loved. The man who was the father of her child, whether he believed it or not. She wanted to scream, to fight, to make him understand. But the cold certainty in his eyes told her that no words would reach him now. Something had broken inside him, and she didn't have the tools to fix it. Slowly, with as much dignity as she could gather from the broken pieces of her heart. She bent down and picked up the torn fragments of the ultrasound photo from the floor. Each piece felt like broken glass in her hands, cutting deep, even though there were no visible wounds. Without another word, without looking back, she turned and walked out of the penthouse. Out of his life, carrying the shattered remains of their future in her trembling hands. 3 hours earlier, everything had been different. Emily had been sitting in Dr. Morrison's office at the Seattle Women's Health Clinic, her heart pounding as she waited for confirmation of what she already suspected deep in her bones. The nausea that struck every morning like clockwork, the exhaustion that made climbing stairs feel like scaling mountains, the strange sensitivity to smells that had plagued her for 3 weeks. All the signs pointed to one thing, but she needed to be certain before telling Daniel. "Congratulations, Emily." Dr. Morrison had smiled warmly as she handed over the ultrasound image, her kind eyes crinkling at the corners. "You're 11 weeks pregnant. The baby is developing normally, and the heartbeat is strong. Everything looks perfect." Emily had stared at the tiny blob on the image, barely able to comprehend that this small collection of cells would become a person. Her child, a piece of her and Daniel brought into the world. She thought about how this news would change everything between them, how they'd have to bring their relationship into the open, how they'd navigate the complexities of being parents together. It would be complicated, yes, but they'd face it together. At least, that's what she'd believed. She had met Daniel Sterling on her first day at Sterling Tech Industries. She was 26 then, fresh from a failed startup that had drained her savings and left her desperate for stability. The position as a junior marketing coordinator wasn't glamorous, but it paid well and offered benefits her previous employer never provided. She hadn't expected to fall for her boss. That wasn't part of any plan she'd made for her life. But Daniel was different from what she'd imagined a tech billionaire would be. Yes, he was demanding and exacting in his standards, pushing his employees to exceed what they thought possible. But he was also kind in unexpected ways. He remembered birthdays, asked about families, stayed late to help junior employees fix mistakes that weren't his responsibility to fix. He had built his company from nothing after recovering from cancer, and that experience had given him a depth and humanity that most wealthy men seemed to lack entirely. Their first real conversation happened during a crisis. The Morrison account, one of Sterling Tech's biggest clients, was threatening to walk because of a presentation disaster. The original team lead had quit suddenly, taking critical files with him out of spite, and the presentation was scheduled for the next morning. Emily had been working late, desperately trying to salvage the project from incomplete data and corrupted files, when Daniel appeared in her cubicle at midnight. "You're still here." He'd seemed genuinely surprised to find anyone in the building at that hour. His tie loosened, and his usually perfect hair mussed from stress. "The Morrison presentation is in 8 hours." Emily had looked up from her computer, with exhausted eyes that burned from staring at screens. Half the data visualizations are gone, and the client research is corrupted. I can't let Mr. Morrison see this disaster. Daniel had rolled up his sleeves, pulled up a chair, and sat down next to her without hesitation. Show me what you have. Let's fix this together. They worked side by side until 4 in the morning, rebuilding the presentation from scratch, using whatever resources they could find. Somewhere around 2 o'clock, Daniel had disappeared and returned with coffee and pastries from an all-night bakery across town. They talked while they worked, about everything and nothing. She learned about his cancer diagnosis at 24, about how facing death had fundamentally changed his priorities and his understanding of what mattered in life. He learned about her childhood in small town Oregon, about her dreams of making a real difference in the business world, about the mother who had sacrificed everything to give her opportunities. When the sun rose and the presentation was finally finished, polished, and professional despite the impossible deadline, Daniel had looked at her with something new in his eyes, something that made her heart skip several beats. You're remarkable, Emily Carter, he'd said softly. Don't let anyone ever tell you otherwise. That had been the beginning of something neither of them had planned, but both of them wanted desperately. 3 weeks later, after successfully landing the Morrison contract and securing a 3-year partnership, Daniel had asked her to dinner. Not as boss and employee. He'd clarified, his usual confidence faltering slightly. As two people who want to know each other better. Emily knew it was risky. Office romances rarely ended well, especially when there was such a significant power imbalance. But something about Daniel made her want to take that risk, made her willing to bet her heart on the possibility that this could be real and lasting. They dated in secret for 4 months, meeting at his penthouse or at restaurants, far from the office where employees might see them. Daniel was careful never to show favoritism at work, never to let their personal relationship affect business decisions. In fact, he seemed to push her harder than other employees, as if trying to prove to everyone, including himself, that she earned her place through merit alone. During those 4 months, Emily fell deeply, completely in love. Daniel was attentive and thoughtful, in ways that surprised her, remembering small details about her preferences, and surprising her with gestures that showed he truly listened. He was also vulnerable in ways she suspected few people ever saw, sharing his fears about the company's future, about whether he was making the right decisions, about the loneliness that came with success and power. They had talked about many things during those late night conversations, his childhood, her dreams, their hopes for the future, but never about children. The topic simply never came up naturally. Emily assumed they had time to discuss family plans eventually. She was on birth control, being careful and responsible. But she knew no contraceptive method was 100% effective. When she realized she was pregnant, her first emotion was fear. But her second emotion, the one that grew stronger with each passing moment, was hope. Maybe this baby, unplanned as it was, could be the push they needed to bring their relationship into the open, to build something real and lasting together. She had been so terribly, devastatingly wrong, surviving the wreckage. Now, riding the subway back to her tiny apartment in a less fashionable part of Seattle. Emily felt completely numb. The torn ultrasound pieces were in her purse, a tangible reminder of how thoroughly her life had just imploded. She tried to process what Daniel had told her about his infertility, about the cancer treatment that had stolen his chance at biological children. Why had he never mentioned it in 4 months of intimate conversation? How had something so significant never come up? Perhaps because he never imagined it would matter. Perhaps because their relationship was always meant to be temporary in his mind, something pleasant but not permanent. Perhaps because he never loved her the way she loved him, with her whole heart and without reservations. Emily's phone buzzed with a text message. She pulled it out with shaking hands, hoping irrationally that it might be Daniel, that he'd realized his mistake and wanted to apologize, wanted to talk, wanted to believe her. Instead, it was from an unknown number. "This is Robert Chen, attorney for Daniel Sterling. Mr. Sterling has instructed me to inform you that any attempt to contact him or make claims regarding paternity will be met with immediate legal action. Any harassment, threats, or defamatory statements will result in criminal charges. Please acknowledge receipt of this message." Emily stared at the text, feeling the last fragile piece of her heart crack and crumble into dust. He wasn't just ending their relationship. He was threatening her with legal consequences. The man who had held her and told her she was the best thing that had ever happened to him was now treating her like a criminal, like someone dangerous who needed to be controlled and silenced. She typed a reply with fingers that shook so badly she had to correct multiple typos. "I understand. Tell your client that I want nothing from him. Not his money, not his name, not anything. But the truth is the truth whether he believes it or not. This baby is his, and someday he'll have to face that fact. Until then, we'll be just fine without him." She sent the message, and then immediately blocked the number. She didn't want to see the lawyer's response. Didn't want any more poison in her life. She had to protect herself and her baby from any more pain. When Emily finally reached her apartment, a modest studio that was all she could afford on her coordinator's salary, she collapsed on her bed and let herself cry. She cried for the relationship that had died tonight. She cried for the future she had imagined that would never happen. She cried for her baby, who would grow up without a father, because that father was too hurt and too stubborn to see the truth right in front of him. But eventually, the tears stopped. They always did. Emily sat up, dried her face with the back of her hand, and looked around her small apartment. It wasn't much. A single room with a tiny kitchen alcove. A bathroom, barely big enough to turn around in, and furniture from thrift stores and sidewalk finds. But it was hers. She had survived worse things than this. She had survived her father walking out when she was 5. She had survived her startup failing and losing everything she'd invested. She would survive this too, because she didn't have a choice. Her baby needed her to be strong. Her hand moved to her stomach, to the place where her child was growing. Still so small, but already so incredibly real. "Okay, little one," she whispered, her voice hoarse but steady. "It's just you and me now. But that's enough. I'll love you enough for two parents. I promise you that with everything I have. The next morning, Emily called in sick to work. She couldn't face going to the office. Couldn't risk seeing Daniel in the hallway or the elevator. Couldn't pretend everything was normal when her entire world had shattered. Instead, she spent the day doing research, looking into pregnancy resources, investigating health insurance options, calculating her budget to see how she could afford prenatal care and eventually childcare on a single income. The numbers were daunting, almost overwhelming. Rent, utilities, food, medical bills, baby supplies, it all added up to more than she made each month. She would need to find a way to increase her income or decrease her expenses, possibly both. But she refused to give up. Other women had done this alone. She would figure it out somehow. Her best friend Rachel called around noon, worried because Emily hadn't responded to the cheerful text messages she'd sent that morning. Emily found herself pouring out the entire story, starting with the pregnancy discovery and ending with the torn ultrasound and the lawyer's threatening text message. That absolute bastard. Rachel's fury came through the phone so clearly that Emily had to hold it away from her ear. How dare he treat you like that? Emily, you have to fight this. You have to demand a paternity test. Make him take responsibility. But Emily was already shaking her head, even though Rachel couldn't see her. No. If he doesn't want to believe me, I can't force him. I'm not going to beg him or drag him through courts, or make my child grow up knowing their father had to be legally compelled to care. This baby deserves better than that. Then what will you do? Rachel's voice softened with concern. Emily took a deep breath, feeling something like determination solidifying in her chest. I'm going to do this alone. I'm going to be the best mother I can possibly be. And Daniel Sterling can live with his choices and his regrets. What she didn't say, what she could barely admit even to herself, was that she still loved him. Despite everything, despite the cruelty and the accusations and the threats, part of her heart still belonged to the man who had made her believe in love again after years of protecting herself. That was perhaps the worst part of this entire nightmare. Not the fear of raising a child alone, not the financial stress, but the knowledge that she would always carry this love for someone who thought she was a liar and a manipulator. But love, Emily was learning in the hardest way possible, wasn't always enough. Sometimes love had to take second place to survival and dignity, and protecting the innocent life that depended on you. Right now, survival meant focusing on her baby and building a life that didn't depend on Daniel Sterling's belief or support, or even his acknowledgement. She just wished it didn't hurt quite so much. She wished her heart would stop hoping that he might change his mind, might realize his mistake, might come back and tell her he was sorry. But as the days passed and silence stretched between them like an unbridgeable chasm, Emily began to accept that some things, once broken, could never be put back together. 3 months crawled by with agonizing slowness. Emily was now 6 months pregnant, her belly round and prominent beneath the loose dresses she wore to work every day. Yes, she still worked at Sterling Tech Industries. though she had requested a transfer to a different department to avoid any possibility of running into Daniel. Human Resources had accommodated her request without asking difficult questions, moving her to the Data Analytics Division on the 4th floor, while Daniel's executive offices occupied the entire top floor of the building. Her new supervisor, Margaret Torres, was a brilliant woman in her late 40s who seemed to understand without being told that Emily needed a fresh start. She assigned challenging projects that kept Emily's mind occupied during the long workdays, and she never pried into Emily's personal life or asked questions about the baby's father. The work was demanding but rewarding, and it gave Emily something to focus on besides her broken heart. But the nights were harder. Alone in her apartment, feeling her baby kick and move and remind her constantly of what could have been, Emily couldn't stop thinking about Daniel. She wondered if he ever thought about her, if he ever regretted his words, if he ever looked at the calendar and calculated how far along she would be by now. She wondered if he'd found someone new, someone he could love without the complications she'd brought into his life. Rachel had been her lifeline during these difficult months. Her best friend had temporarily moved in to help with expenses and to keep Emily from drowning in loneliness and worry. Rachel worked as a pediatric nurse at Seattle Children's Hospital, and she had connections that helped Emily find excellent prenatal care at a significantly reduced cost. Dr. Sarah Kim, a compassionate obstetrician who specialized in high-risk pregnancies, had taken Emily on as a patient and treated her with such kindness that the monthly appointments became something to look forward to rather than dread. "Everything looks perfect," Dr. Kim had told her at the most recent visit, her warm smile genuine and reassuring. "Baby is measuring right on track. Heartbeat is strong and steady. Have you thought about names yet?" Emily had smiled, her hand resting protectively on her belly. "Sophie. I want to name her Sophie Grace, after my grandmother." "Beautiful choice." Dr. Kim made notes in her chart. "And the father, is he involved at all? Will he be present for the delivery?" Emily's smile had faded like sunlight disappearing behind clouds. "No. He's not part of our lives. It'll just be me and my friend Rachel in the delivery room." What Dr. Kim didn't know, what nobody except Rachel knew, was that Emily occasionally saw Daniel in the building. Brief, devastating glimpses that never lasted more than a few seconds. His profile in the elevator before the doors closed, his voice echoing down a hallway, his familiar stride crossing the lobby, while she stood frozen behind a pillar. Each sighting sent a spike of pain through her chest so sharp it was almost physical. But she had become expert at keeping her face neutral, at pretending her heart wasn't breaking all over again, every single time. Meanwhile, across town in his penthouse, Daniel Sterling was having the worst 3 months of his entire life. Worse even than the cancer diagnosis that had nearly killed him a decade ago. He threw himself into work with manic intensity, closing deals and launching products at a pace that worried his executive team. He barely slept anymore, rarely ate properly, and snapped at employees who had never seen him lose his composure before. His younger sister Victoria had noticed the dramatic change. She lived in San Francisco and only visited twice a year. But when she arrived for Thanksgiving and saw her brother's gaunt face and hollow eyes, she had demanded to know what was happening. Daniel had told her everything about Emily, about the pregnancy announcement, about his absolute certainty that the baby couldn't possibly be his. He explained his infertility, the cancer treatment, the medical certainty that he could never father children. He waited for Victoria to agree with him, to validate his anger and his actions. Instead, his sister had listened in increasingly troubled silence. When he finally finished talking, she asked a question that made his blood run cold. "When did you last have your fertility tested?" Her voice was quiet but intense. Daniel frowned, confused by the question. "What does that matter?" "I was told 10 years ago that I was completely sterile. The doctors were very clear about it." 10 years ago, Daniel." Victoria leaned forward, her expression serious. "Medical science changes. Bodies change. Have you ever heard of spontaneous fertility recovery after cancer treatment? It's extremely rare. Maybe one case in several thousand. But it does happen. There are documented cases." Daniel felt something cold and terrible settle in his stomach, but he pushed it away. "Even if that were true, which I seriously doubt, it doesn't change anything. Emily lied to me. She tried to trap me."
Did she?
Victoria pulled out her phone and began searching for something. "Or did you accuse an innocent woman of deception because you were too afraid to hope?" "Daniel, when was the last time you actually verified your infertility status? You've been telling yourself for 10 years that you could never have children. What if that stopped being completely true years ago, and you never bothered to check?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that Daniel didn't want to examine. His sister continued relentlessly, reading from her phone. "Listen to this study from Johns Hopkins. In rare cases, testicular function can partially recover years after chemotherapy treatment, particularly in patients who were young at the time of treatment and received lower dose protocols. While complete recovery is uncommon, even partial restoration of spermatogenesis can result in viable pregnancies. Daniel, you were 24 when you were treated. That's exactly the age group this study is talking about. It doesn't matter," Daniel said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Even if there was a tiny possibility, which there isn't, Emily should have told me the truth." "She should have. She tried to tell you the truth." Victoria interrupted, her patience finally breaking. "She showed you an ultrasound of your baby, and you tore it up in her face. You called her a liar and had your lawyer threaten her. Did it ever occur to you that maybe, just maybe, she was telling the absolute truth, and you were the one who was wrong?" Daniel stood up abruptly, walking to the windows that overlooked the city lights. "I can't be wrong about this. If I'm wrong, then I've destroyed the best thing that ever happened to me. I've thrown away my child, my chance at a family. I can't be wrong, Victoria. I can't be." His sister came to stand beside him, her hand gentle on his shoulder. "Then prove you're right. Get tested. Know for certain. Because if there's even the smallest chance that Emily was telling the truth, don't you owe it to her and to that baby to find out? Don't you owe it to yourself?" Daniel closed his eyes, feeling the weight of those words crushing down on him. For 3 months, he had been so certain, so absolutely convinced that Emily had betrayed him. He had built a wall of anger and hurt to protect himself from the pain. But now his sister had taken a hammer to that wall, and cracks were appearing everywhere. What if he was wrong? What if Emily had been telling the truth all along? What if there was a baby out there, his baby, growing inside the woman he still loved despite everything he'd told himself? The possibility was terrifying, because it meant he had made the worst mistake of his entire life. "I'll think about it," he finally said, his voice barely audible. But Victoria wasn't finished. "While you're thinking, let me tell you what I found out. I called human resources at your company this afternoon. Told them I needed to send a gift to an employee. Emily Carter is still working for you, Daniel. She's 6 months pregnant now. She transferred to a different department, probably to avoid seeing you. She's doing this completely alone because you refuse to believe her." The image hit Daniel like a physical blow. Emily, 6 months pregnant, still working, still supporting herself, still facing this enormous challenge alone, while he sat in his penthouse, nursing his wounded pride. If she was a liar and a manipulator, wouldn't she have made a bigger scene? Wouldn't she have gone to the media or tried to force a paternity test? Instead, she had simply walked away with dignity, asking nothing from him except his belief, which he had refused to give. For the first time in 3 months, doubt crept into Daniel's certainty. Real doubt, not just the whispers he'd been suppressing, but actual, undeniable doubt that maybe, possibly, terrifyingly, he had been wrong about everything. "I need to know for sure," he heard himself say. "I need to get tested, need to know if there's any possibility." "Then do it," Victoria said firmly. "Tomorrow. First thing. Get a complete fertility workup. And Daniel, if it turns out you were wrong about this, if you can father children after all, you need to be prepared to do whatever it takes to make this right. That means apologizing. That means taking responsibility. That means being the man I know you can be instead of the scared, angry version you've been for the past 3 months." That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He lay in his enormous bed, in his empty penthouse, staring at the ceiling and thinking about Emily. He remembered the way she laughed, the way she bit her lip, when she was concentrating, the way she had looked at him like he was something precious and rare. He remembered the night she told him about her father leaving, how she'd cried in his arms, and he'd promised her he would never abandon her like that. And then he'd done exactly that. The thought made him feel physically sick. He had accused her of the worst kind of deception. He had destroyed the ultrasound photo of what might be his child. He had threatened her with legal action. If she really had been telling the truth, if the baby really was his, then he had committed an unforgivable betrayal. He had become the very thing she feared most, someone who abandoned her when she needed him. The next morning, Daniel called his doctor and demanded an immediate appointment for fertility testing. Dr. Matthews had been his oncologist during his cancer treatment and had followed his recovery for the past decade. When Daniel explained what he needed, There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Daniel, I understand you want certainty, but I should warn you that getting your hopes up might not be wise. The treatment you received typically causes permanent, irreversible infertility. The chances of any recovery are extremely small. I understand that, Daniel said tersely. But I need to know for absolute certain. I need every test you can do, the most comprehensive fertility workup possible. Money is no object. I need answers, and I need them as soon as possible. All right, Dr. Matthews agreed. Come in this afternoon. We'll start with a semen analysis, which will give us initial results within a few hours. If we find anything surprising, we'll run more comprehensive tests. Those few hours waiting for results were the longest of Daniel's life. He sat in his office pretending to work, but his mind was elsewhere, spinning through scenarios and possibilities. What if there was even one viable sperm? What if his doctors had been wrong about the permanence of his condition? What if Emily's baby really was his child? And more terrifying still, what if it wasn't? What if this hope turned out to be just another disappointment, another reminder of what he'd lost? But even worse than that possibility was the growing certainty in his gut that Emily had been telling the truth all along, and he had been too damaged and too afraid to see it. His phone rang at 4:30. Dr. Matthews' voice was carefully controlled, professional, but Daniel could hear the surprise underneath. Daniel, you need to come back to the office. We need to discuss these results in person. Daniel's heart stopped. Just tell me, is it possible? Could I father a child? There was a pause that seemed to last forever. Then Dr. Matthews spoke words that changed everything. Yes, Daniel. Against all odds and medical expectations, you have functional sperm production. Your count is lower than normal, which would make natural conception difficult, but not impossible. Based on these results, you absolutely could be the biological father of this child. The world seemed to stop spinning. Daniel gripped his desk, so hard his knuckles turned white. Everything he had believed for 3 months, every accusation he'd hurled at Emily, every cruel word and threatening message, all of it had been based on a false certainty. He had been wrong. Catastrophically, unforgivably wrong. Oh God, he whispered. What have I done?